The former Diddy assistants who say they were threatened, abused, underpaid, even one who claims she was sexually assaulted by Sean Combs, are they going to be the downfall of the rap mogul? Their testimony is explosive and so important to this sex trafficking and racketeering case, so we're going to go through what they had to say and how this all fits into the overall charges. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. So I gotta say, in a racketeering and sex trafficking case, Sean Diddy Combs' assistants, who's more important, right? They are key. They are key to this prosecution. Remember what prosecutors are saying here, right? What are they claiming? That it's basically Combs accused of being part of this criminal enterprise that he ran, this criminal group, this criminal association of people that work together to commit or cover up a series of crimes like kidnapping, forced labor, arson, bribery, sex trafficking. It's about an agreement to further a pattern of criminal activity. So if I'm saying that, don't you need the people who were in the inner circle to explain what was going on, whether or not they're alleged co-conspirators or accomplices or not? The point is, Combs is charged with racketeering conspiracy. He couldn't have done all of this on his own. Don't you need to know who the staff are and what they have to say? And by the way, for racketeering conspiracy, the prosecution needs to prove at least two of those underlying predicate crimes, the ones I mentioned before. To give you a better idea of this as we talk about the assistants today, I just want to read you some parts from Combs' indictment that kind of set the stage for this. For example, quote, "The defendant abused, threatened, and coerced women and others around him to fulfill his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his conduct. To do so, Combs relied on the employees, resources, and influence of the multifaceted business empire that he led and controlled, creating a criminal enterprise whose members and associates engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other crimes, sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The defendant engaged in a persistent and pervasive pattern of abuse toward women and other individuals. Combs assaulted women by, among other things, striking, punching, dragging, throwing objects at, and kicking them." By the way they've positioned this is not just alleged victims or named victims in this case, but quite general, right? Talking about assaulting women. Combs' violence was also not limited to these women. It extended to his employees, witnesses to his abuse, and others. The defendant used the Combs business, including certain employees, to carry out, facilitate, and cover up his acts of violence, abuse, and commercial sex. Those employees, including security staff, household staff, personal assistants, and high-ranking supervisors and other close associates, acted as Combs' intermediaries, and their conduct was facilitated and assisted by Combs' control of the Combs business. By the way, there's a part of the indictment that talks about purpose of the criminal enterprise. Quote, "Preserving, protecting, promoting, and enhancing the power, reputation, and brand of Sean Combs, fulfilling the personal desires of Combs, securing absolute loyalty from members of the Combs enterprise, including through acts of violence and threats." So I kind of set the stage on what we're about to talk about. And you have to now wonder whether the people who Combs allegedly demoralized, took advantage of, forced to work insane hours under intense conditions, abused, underpaid, threatened, again, taking all these allegations as true, are they going to be Sean Combs' downfall? Okay, let's talk about it. I want to bring on right now Law&Crime's legal counsel, Elizabeth Vulaj, who I always love to talk about any legal topic with, but particularly this topic. Elizabeth, before we even get into the specifics, I'm right? I'm right. The assistants are key to this case.
They're absolutely key. So again, one of the things that we always keep coming back to this with the racketeering charge is that it's not enough just to rely on Cassie's testimony or, even one other individual's testimony. They have to show a widespread pattern and enterprise. So again, people that assisted, facilitated, did a lot of these things. And with the underlying acts that you mentioned, forced labor, kidnapping, I think a lot of what the different assistants testified to helped to support that. So I think it's really, really key.
Hey everybody, this is another Law&Crime legal alert. Did you know that children are being diagnosed with serious conditions like type 2 diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and the research is potentially linking ultra-processed foods to all this? Yeah, well, Morgan & Morgan, they are stepping in to fight to hold these food companies accountable. With decades of experience fighting large corporations, they are ready to stand up for the families who deserve justice. So if your child under 21 has been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes or fatty liver disease, then visit www.forthepeople.com/food or scan the QR code on screen to learn more. So one of the themes that I think they helped with prosecutors here is help to prove or trying to prove there was a criminal enterprise, that they were all working together to fulfill one common purpose, one common goal, fulfill the desires of Sean Combs. So one of his assistants, David James, testified that during his interview with the head of HR, she told him, quote, "This is Mr. Combs' kingdom. We're all here to serve it." Former assistant who testified under the pseudonym Mia told jurors that one of her jobs was, quote, "protect him at all times." And if we accept other testimony in this case that the freak-offs were crimes, right, these prolonged sexual experiences, usually with commercial sex workers, if we accept these are crimes, that they were sexual episodes for people like Cassandra Ventura who were coerced into performing, that she was forced to do this with Combs using threats, violence, intimidation, that if we accept these are crimes and these are the scenes of sex trafficking, did these assistants help to facilitate all of this and cover it up? Why? One of Combs' former assistants, George Kaplan, testified that his job was to clean up the hotel rooms in Miami, New York, LA. He testified lots of empty bottles, empty Gatorade bottles, empty liquor bottles, and often baby oil. Kaplan was also tasked with delivering a medicine kit. This was a bag apparently filled with prescription pills and pain meds, and had to get Combs drugs like MDMA. David James testified that he set up hotel rooms with thousands of dollars in cash. Interesting if we're talking about commercial sex, prostitutes, or, male sex workers, that he got drugs for Combs, including Percocet, that he got filled under his own name, that he testified, quote, there were probably 25 or 30 different pill bottles. Capricorn Clark, another assistant, testified she was asked to get drugs for him, including cocaine, while they were in France. Elizabeth, is this proving racketeering conspiracy?
I think so. So one of the things that I noticed about the different parts of testimony from the assistants was obviously Kaplan and James, you mentioned, talked about their roles, and they had to set up the hotel rooms, purchase supplies for it, be in charge of the cleanup afterwards, because Combs had specifically instructed them, apparently, don't let the hotel staff do this. You guys have to basically take care of it. This is your job. But also what the various assistants testified to helps play into the underlying acts of the racketeering charge. So, one of the things that Mia had talked about was being entrapped in his home and not being able to leave when she wanted. It could help add to the kidnapping charge. One of the other things that one of the assistants had testified to, I think it was Capricorn Clark, was the multiple hours that they had to work over the weekends, 100-hour weekends. If she didn't comply or want to do one of the duties that he was asked to, she would apparently be threatened. So that kind of goes into forced labor. So all of these different pieces of testimony help play into the underlying charges. And it also, what they observed that happened between him and Cassie Ventura helps support that.
So we're going to get into all that and focusing on the freak-offs and allegedly setting them up or, providing the supplies for them or cleaning up. Is this that they're conspiring? And by the way, they don't need a formal agreement, although it seems like there was a common understanding of what the job was and what was happening. I think that would be the allegation from prosecutors. Are they conspiring to commit sex trafficking, a predicate for racketeering? Is that an argument you think that's going to be made? If they're talking about, well, one of the underlying crimes for racketeering is sex trafficking, well, them setting up the hotel rooms, getting the supplies, this is sex trafficking? This is them conspiring to commit sex trafficking? You think that's a fair argument?
It could be, because one of the things that's being alleged is that setting up of the hotel rooms of these freak-offs, again, what the prosecution is saying is that Cassie didn't want to enter these freak-offs of her own free will, that she was, forced into doing it by threats. Diddy would threaten various things like releasing, explicit videotapes of her, physical violence, all of these things. So the prosecution's main argument is that these freak-offs were evidence of trafficking, of transportation to engage in prostitution. So by them facilitating the hotel rooms for these freak-offs, you could make that link. But I don't think the prosecution's going to be trying to go after the assistants. I know there was talk of Kaplan receiving immunity and things like that. So I think they're really trying to utilize the assistants to show this was an overall enterprise, not necessarily to go after the assistants, but more just the overall scheme.
Right. In terms of forgetting, the criminal liability for them or lack thereof, I think it's the idea of trying to establish how they were working together to make this happen. Even, by the way, the drug possession, the drug distribution underlying predicate crimes for racketeering. If they're talking about getting Combs drugs, is that satisfy that predicate?
Yeah, it could be. That was one of the things that the prosecution had talked a lot about was his consumption of drugs and illegal drugs. I think that could be possibly part of it, but I think the big thing is going to be the specific setting up of the hotel rooms for these freak-offs, because that is what underlies a lot of the other charges. Obviously, the drug charges and everything, it adds to the overall allegations against him, but I think the biggest thing is the setting up of these hotel rooms for these freak-offs, that it wasn't just sort of on-the-fly consensual acts, but these were things that had happened multiple times, set up specifically for this.
You mentioned forced labor. Okay, so forced labor is another predicate underlying crime for racketeering that the prosecution could prove to get him convicted of that. By the way, we're talking life in prison, potentially life in prison for racketeering. It's the top charge here. So forced labor under federal law, look this up, is defined as whoever knowingly provides or obtains the labor or services of a person by threats of serious harm to or physical restraint against that person or another person by means of any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause the person to believe that if the person did not perform such labor or services, that person or another person would suffer serious harm or physical restraint. I think this is probably, or version of it, is going to make its way into the jury instructions. But Mia, she testified that her first day as Combs' personal assistant was 24 hours long. One time she claimed she worked 5 days straight with no sleep. She was on extended release Adderall, had a breakdown essentially. She had to do everything for Combs, including cracking his knuckles. She had to stay attached to her BlackBerry 24/7. David James testified he worked 3 weeks straight without a day off. Capricorn Clark testified that Combs allegedly got angry at her for taking too long to run an errand, with him stating, "See, your problem is you want a life and you can't have that." And when she apparently told another employee that she hates it here, Combs allegedly ran towards her, pushed her, and said, "If you hate it here, get the F out of my house." Mia testified that he threw me against the wall. He's thrown me into a pool. He's thrown an ice bucket on my head. He slammed my arm into a door. There was testimony about being under the constant threat of being fired. David James testified that when another assistant went to the hospital for dehydration after overworking, Combs security allegedly said, "You know what rhymes with tired? Fired." Elizabeth, it's harrowing accounts nonetheless. Is it forced labor, or is it, maybe as the defense is going to characterize it, it's a tough job? Tough job. Lawyers work a lot. Investment bankers work a lot. They work crazy hours. Why is this different? Other than the fact that we got the allegations of, physical assault.
Right, yeah. So you have the allegations of physical assault and threats, and that plays directly into forced labor. Obviously the details, all of the assistants had testified to working 100 hours over the weekend, working for weeks nonstop with no breaks, essentially being on call 24/7, right? But the allegations of the continuous threats and physical violence is the difference between a really tough job and a really demanding boss versus forced labor. And I think also the other thing that I believe it was Capricorn Clark who had testified to this is that after she had worked for Diddy, one of the things that someone in the industry had told her was, things could be really bad for you if you continue to speak out about this. So constantly facing those potential threats is what's going to play right into the forced labor. And essentially, that's going to be the difference between the defense saying, well, you could have quit at any time, but if they can show if they had quit, they would have been in possible danger. That's a good counter argument to that.
I mean, David James testified to something very interesting. He said that Combs essentially blackmailed him, that he'd been high at a New Year's Eve party. Combs brought him in, had footage of him, and said, "Yo, Playboy, is that you dancing around the party?" And according to James, he said, "Yes, sir." And he testified, quote, and he kind of nodded his head and he said, "Okay, I want to keep this footage in case I ever need it." What do you make of that?
Yeah, that was really interesting. So I think that echoes a lot of the allegations of what Cassie Ventura made in a different context. One of the things that she had said was these freak-offs were allegedly filmed, and Combs would continuously use that as threats against her. He would threaten to, release the tapes to her parents, to the public, knowing what the damage of what that could do to her, in terms of the professional sense and also the personal sense. So when I read that, I thought, okay, this is sort of mirrors what Cassie's saying, but in a different context. And he had told James, great, I'm going to keep this in case I need to use it later. So again, that plays into the potential threat, holding something over someone's head. Again, if the defense counters back and says, well, you could have quit, and the prosecution can show, right, but there would have been serious ramifications if I had quit.
So it's like forced labor. I mean, I think it plays a number of factors, right? It corroborates what Cassie had said had happened to her. I think it goes to the overall narrative of a pattern of abuse towards people. But it also, I think, is it maybe help prove forced labor, understanding the forced labor, why the hours matter. But you know, Elizabeth, everything changed when Mia also testified that she was sexually assaulted by Sean Combs multiple times. And this happened, my understanding, during her employment. You wonder how that changes the game, because it's not sex trafficking, right? I don't believe she's one of the victims with respect to sex trafficking. It's not about that. It is for forced labor, right?
So her testimony was really, really critical. She's not just testifying as to things that she saw between Cassie and Diddy, but things that had also happened to her as well. So again, you know, the alleged rape, it doesn't mirror sex trafficking or transportation to engage in prostitution, but it sort of plays into the overall theme of, again, committing acts against someone against their will. So that also adds the overall charges. And then again, using physical violence, threats, obviously alleged rape, form of physical violence. He's apparently using that to get what he wants from this employee. And I also thought in terms of Mia, some of the other things she had testified to were really interesting that could possibly counter, again, the defense's argument of, well, this was all consensual. You could have just left. You know, she had talked about being stopped in I believe, a police car with Sean Combs and the police being enamored with him, trying to talk to HR about some of these issues. And HR, essentially what she said was HR was just sort of used as a buffer and a cover up for Diddy, being scared of physical acts of violence. So all of these things I think was really interesting to help sort of play into the idea of it wasn't that easy to just leave or quit.
She testified. It was very quick, but it felt like forever. I couldn't tell him no, like about a sandwich. I couldn't tell him no about anything. I knew his power and I knew his control over me. And I didn't want to lose everything that I worked so hard for, or this world, that was the only thing I had anymore. That's what she said, Elizabeth.
Yeah, and that also, I think, echoes a lot of what Capricorn Clark had said, too. She worked for him on and off for 10 years, and afterwards she talked about the difficulty of getting another job, that Diddy was obviously extremely well connected, that he could, you know, badmouth her to the entire industry. So I think it's so interesting to me how these assistants worked for him at different times, had different experiences, but a lot of what they're saying seems to overlap.
Yeah, this idea of corroborating the force, fraud, coercion, the elements of sex trafficking for Cassie Ventura, why she was allegedly induced into engaging in these sexual performances. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about Cassie's corroboration through these assistants. I think it was a big theme throughout their testimony. And the assistants really hit upon this in a few ways. So Mia had testified that Cassie seemed nervous before a, quote, hotel night. So possibly a freak off, that Cassie started getting stomach issues because of it. I think that goes to the issue of lack of consent. You stick with David James for a second. He recalled Ventura saying to him once, I can't get out. Mr. Combs oversees so much of my life. He controls my music career. He pays for my apartment. He gives me an allowance. James testified, I just didn't think that she could easily leave. So big there, Elizabeth.
Yeah, really, really big. Again, I think it helps because if you have Cassie Ventura testifying as to this, saying, I couldn't just leave, it just only helps to have other people who were in their lives at the time who witnessed what was going on to help corroborate that and explain why it was so difficult. And one of the things that I believe is George Kaplan had testified to was being on a plane with them, with multiple other members of Diddy's entourage and staff, and allegedly hearing a beating going on, you know, Cassie Ventura screaming, and no one had intervened. She had apparently had said, why, you know, is anyone seeing this? Basically, why is no one coming to my help or assistance? And that, again, even though it's not a detail of a freak off, it helps to show the overall pattern of alleged physical violence and threats. And that's what the prosecution is saying he used to pressure her into these freak offs.
And Elizabeth, James testified that Combs told him once that Ventura was, quote, very moldable. So that seems like if the jury accepts that as true, it fits right into the description of what Combs did or allegedly did to control Cassie in this sex trafficking pattern, right?
Yeah, that was really, really a key moment for me when I was reviewing the testimony. So, you know, when they got together, she was 19, he was 37, huge age gap, huge disparity, wealth, power, celebrity, all of that. And to have someone directly testify that Diddy had explicitly told him she was easily moldable, I think that just sort of shows his overall thinking in terms of this relationship and how he was able to use, again, threats, coercion, influence, not just in terms of physical violence, but again, everything that he held over her with her apartment, her career, you know, her family, all of that. So that was really, really interesting. I think it said a lot.
And the assistants, they testified to witnessing Combs allegedly physically abuse Cassie. There was testimony that Mia tried to physically stop Combs at one point. George Kaplan testified that he heard Cassie screaming in a bedroom of Combs' private jet, with her saying at one time, "Isn't anybody seeing this?" There was crashing glass. He apparently saw Combs standing over Cassie, who was cowering. Mia, by the way, testified that she was instructed to, quote, keep tabs on Cassie. And there was one time that she recounted to the jury that she was told by Combs allegedly, keep Cassie in this hotel room, but they both apparently snuck out to attend a Prince party. All was okay until, she says, Combs apparently arrived. They tried to run away. He apparently catches up, and he starts allegedly physically attacking Cassie to the point where Prince's security has to get involved. And Mia was then suspended by Combs. So, Elizabeth, if the assistants are testifying, I saw abuse, but I didn't do anything, does this make them co-conspirators in sex trafficking? I mean, how much do you think also this helps corroborate Cassie's claims?
Right. So, it's the fact of them not intervening. I think it's not great. I don't know if it's enough to essentially get them to co-conspirators. Again, especially if they say physical violence, threats, all of these things that were happening to Cassie, if they had intervened, probably the same thing would have happened to them. So I think more the details in terms of them setting up the hotel rooms for the freak offs. And, because from their testimony, it was obvious they had knowledge of what was going on. You mentioned they had talked about Cassie seeming kind of nervous before all this was going on. So, it was apparent they had at least some knowledge that this wasn't consensual. So I think the setup of the hotel rooms for the freak-offs actually points more towards that. But again, I don't think it's a goal of the prosecution to really go after the assistants. I think it's them trying to use them to show how Combs had used multiple people and kind of allegedly funneled a lot of this through his businesses to achieve these acts. So it's not helpful that they didn't intervene, obviously, but I think there's a good counter argument to that for them to say, well, this was how physically violent and powerful and threatening he was that we couldn't intervene.
I think it goes to a larger issue. So aside from the fact that it's just corroborating what Cassie had testified to, it goes to the lack of doing anything. I think that goes to maybe explain or help explain why Cassie didn't do anything. What do I mean by that? Capricorn Clark testified that she called Cassie's mom, Regina, and told her, "He's beating the S out of your daughter. I can't call the police, but you can. Please help her." And, when you think about that, right, the idea of, oh, why didn't Cassie leave? Why didn't she report Sean Combs? Talked about it before, Dawn Richard testifying that Combs beat her up in front of celebrities and nobody stepped in. If you have the assistants saying the same thing, it goes to that power dynamic. Because the defense is saying she's not credible, she could have left, everything was consensual, she was a willing participant, look at what her text messages say. But the other way of looking at it is, well, what was she really thinking and feeling, and what could she really do in that position? And the assistants, I think, kind of explain that.
They do. They really explain it a lot because, again, very wisely, the prosecution started off with Cassie's direct testimony, which was obviously really powerful. But the assistants, what they've been doing is corroborating by saying, this is the physical violence we witnessed. These are the threats we witnessed, both against themselves and also seeing it happen between Cassie. I think that's why all of the assistants' testimony is really, really key here, is because they're saying this, I was threatened, I was a victim of physical violence against him, but I also saw it happen to her. And on all different levels. Obviously, the physical violence that was committed against Cassie Ventura, but, the alleged extortion, you mentioned her mom, her mother had given testimony about essentially being allegedly extorted for $20,000 for, a videotape of alleged sexual activity happening between Cassie and other people. So all of these things, I think, directly play into that. And I think all of the assistants' testimony is really, really key here, both in setting up how this was an enterprise and also, the different ways that money was possibly funneled. One of the things that George Kaplan testified to was he was asked by Sean Combs to apparently buy creams and makeup to cover up Cassie's bruises after a violent incident. And he said he used the company credit card to do that. So I think in terms of them testifying as to what happened to them against Combs, what they saw, how money was possibly funneled through that, because that's a big thing. Prosecution is saying that the enterprise was was set up through bad boy records, Combs Enterprise, all of these things. I think it's so critical.
And I think he also testified he was paid in cash or reimbursed in cash for the more personal kind of items that were used. So prosecutors could say, yeah, he didn't want a paper trail on it because he knew it was for illegal activity. I think that's probably a fair argument. Okay, want to talk about something else. I want to talk about Capricorn Clark because I think she is important for another reason too. She helps prove, and we talked about this a little bit, the predicate crime of kidnapping for racketeering. So December 2011, after Combs apparently found out that Cassie was romantically involved with rapper Kid Cudi, Combs apparently shows up to her home at 5:30, 6 in the morning, bangs on her door. She claims he has a gun in his hand, says, "Why didn't you tell me?" Tells her to get dressed, that we're going to kill him, that she's essentially forced into a car with Combs. They go to Kid Cudi's place. That leads into the whole allegation that they broke into his house and whatnot. Elizabeth, that was something I have to imagine the jury is going to be focusing on and something prosecution is going to be focused on in terms of kidnapping, right?
Exactly. So you said it perfectly, is that, she had testified that Combs had come to her basically with a gun in his hand saying, we're going to go kill Kid Cudi. She was forced essentially against her will to get into the car and to go there. That plays into the kidnapping charge. And I also think it plays into a bit of the arson charge, even though it didn't happen exactly at that moment. One of the things that a lot of analysts talked about was the difficulty of linking Diddy to the potential arson of the car because, there's not video evidence of it. It's hard to make that direct link, I think some people were saying. But if you have an assistant saying he had a gun in his hand, he was ready to do physical violence against Kid Cudi, allegedly he had talked about wanting to kill him, I think that helps corroborate the possibility of him setting his car on fire, which Kid Cudi had testified to. So it goes into, I think, the kidnapping. I think it also plays into a little bit of the arson, even though it didn't happen at that moment.
It's a good point. And by the way, they can find him guilty of racketeering, like if they think he committed arson or drug crimes or forced labor or kidnapping. They don't even if they don't believe the whole sex trafficking part of this case. And that's what's essential with this kind of criminal enterprise, racketeering conspiracy charge. But by the way, Capricorn Clark, she also testified that Combs threatened her too, that when she started her job with him, he threatened to kill her over her former connection to his rival Suge Knight. She testified that when jewelry went missing, she was taken to this dilapidated floor of what would become the Bad Boy building, where she was forced to take a lie detector test, and the man who conducted the test allegedly said that he would throw her in the East River. So, Elizabeth, how does this support the charges? Does it help with forced labor? Does it corroborate what happened to Cassie? Is this a pattern of racketeering? It's explosive testimony, but how does it specifically fit in?
I think all of the above. So it plays into the alleged violence, the threats, the physical violence. All of that is the prosecution's main theme as to why there should be sex trafficking charges, why there should be transportation to engage in prostitution. Specifically with sex trafficking, the difference between consensual group sex between adults versus sex trafficking is, again, the non-willingness to participate. And what they're saying is the threats and physical violence, that's the key missing link there. Even if it seemed like Cassie Ventura might have wanted to engage in this, that's what, kind of helps fill in that gap. So I think all of that helps to corroborate that. I think a lot of it also goes to, Combs's overall nature. The more that they can testify that these kinds of incidents happen, the more believable it is to a jury, right? Because all of this is being presented to a jury. Jurors are human beings. So the more testimony they hear about, ongoing patterns of behavior like this, the more it can play into that. So again, the assistants testifying, these are things that happen to me. It's always more believable to a jury if you have 5 people making the same kind of allegations versus just one, let's say with Cassie Ventura. So I think it helps play into all of that.
Before we wrap things up, we've been talking so much about how this helps the prosecution, but the defense has been putting on a case, and you do wonder if there are credibility issues here with the assistants. Why? George Kaplan apparently granted immunity. David James testified he signed a proffer agreement, usually where what you say can't be used against you. Capricorn Clark was confronted with the fact that after all of this, after being fired, she apparently tried to work for Combs as recently as April 2024. Mia had reportedly not initially mentioned when speaking with prosecutors that she was sexually assaulted by Sean Combs. Is all of this problematic for the prosecution? Is this problematic for their credibility, Elizabeth?
Right. I think that's exactly what the defense is going to play into. Well, one, a lot of what they've been trying to counter with Cassie Ventura's testimony is, well, you received compensation for this. You were exposed to this, sort of high rolling lifestyle. You received a lot of benefits from this. You could have left at any point. So I think that's something that they're going to go into. You mentioned Capricorn Clark. One of the things that defense tried to point to was text messages exchange where, her and Combs sort of had like a warm rapport. So I think they're going to point to that and say, again, if it was so bad, why are you trying to work for him again? You seem to have this warm sort of engagement with him. I think those are all fair points that the defense is going to try to point to, because again, prosecution is putting on their case. It's the defense's job to sort of chip away at that. So I think those are all fair points that they're going to make. And, the overall benefit that they got from working for someone like Combs, a lot of what the assistants testified to is initially they were really excited. This was someone that was huge in the industry. They viewed it as a great opportunity. So I think the defense is also going to try to play at that and say, well, didn't you benefit from this opportunity? A lot of them, including Capricorn Clark, said she was actually worse off, that it hurt her chances in the industry. She faced threats and things like that. But I think that's the defense's job, is to chip away at it.
Elizabeth Vulaj, thank you so much for breaking down this really important component of this case. I wanted to do an episode on the assistants as more and more were testifying, because I think they play a central role in this case, both for the prosecution and the defense. So thank you so much for taking the time. It was great seeing you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.